Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are wrapping up our discussion related to how you can use your surname to trace your family tree. Many people are really tied to an outcome when it comes to understanding their heritage, and so they are more concerned with outcome versus the simple truth. And so many people are not willing to sort of follow that trail wherever it may lead. Some people are really tied to having this identity that traces back to Africa, or they are really tied to having an identity that traces right here to the Americas, and so they are focused on an Indian identity. Some individuals are really focused on having an identity that carries them over into the Middle East, into Israel. Some people are equally committed to finding a history that takes them over into the Middle East as a Moabite. And so it makes it very difficult for people to find the truth and hold on to that truth. And it doesn't help that there are many people on social media who are encouraging people to focus more on the history of humanity 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, to the exclusion of understanding your personal history 100 years ago. And so it makes it very difficult for people to stay focused in terms of understanding their history, making sense of that history, and using it to better understand their roots and how they came to be in America in the first place. There are many people, believe it or not, that are outside of the United States or even in the United States now that are wondering when some people in the United States are going to figure out their histories. So there are individuals in the Caribbean who are looking at people who understand themselves as Americans, particularly Americans who are brown, and they are wondering, when are you going to figure out that your surname is the key to your heritage? There are many people in America who do not have brown skin, and they are wondering when those with brown skin are going to figure out that their surnames trace back to their real ancestors. There are many people on the continent of Africa who are wondering the same thing. There is so much focus on Africa, and many people who are on that continent are wondering when people in America are going to start to understand that just like for them, the surnames of people in America trace back to specific ancestors. And so we are going to wrap up this discussion related to getting past confirmation bias so that you can get to the truth. And as always, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now, before we get started, one of the things that I want you to do is I want you to become familiar with inductive and deductive reasoning as you go on this journey to better understand your heritage, particularly as you're looking at surnames and trying to understand history. And many people are hitting all sorts of roadblocks in terms of tracing their ancestors. But if you get familiar with inductive and deductive reasoning and how it relates to tracing your ancestry using your surnames, you will be much more informed and you will be much more comfortable as you pursue understanding your heritage. Okay, so as we get started, we're going to quickly look at these definitions for surnames so that people understand exactly what surnames are and what purpose they serve. And surnames are different from your actual given name, so your first name. And so surnames have specific meaning in terms of heredity. And so a surname is your hereditary name, and it's the name that is common to all of a family group or a clan or a tribe even in some instances. And this is distinct from your first name. And so this is the name that your clan, that cluster of people that go together in terms of heredity, this is the name that is given to them, and it gives you that collective identity. It tells you something about your ancestors. It may tell you things like the way that your ancestors looked, or the occupation of your ancestors, or where they came from in terms of geography. And so the surname is very, very important, and you really need to get in touch with all of these different surnames that are attached to you. Now, what's important to note is that your surname is going to give an indicator of your ancestry. And so you can see when you use surname in a sentence. Here's the example. Judging from your surname, I guess that your family is Italian. That is because your surname actually gives clues to your family's roots. And so your surname actually traces back to a particular ethnicity. It traces back to a particular region on the planet. And so your surname is going to give you some indication as to where your ancestors came from, what your ancestors might have done, and also give you some indication as to how your ancestors might have ended up in the United States in the first place. And you can see here another definition of surname. It is the added name derived from occupation or other circumstances, and it's also the name that is borne in common by members of a family. Now let's look at this on a practical level. Each person has parents and grandparents, and each grandparent is attached to a surname. So this gets broad very quickly. So with grandparents, you have 4 surnames attached to your grandparents, just directly, 4 surnames. There is the married name and the maiden name for the grandmother, and then you have the surname for the grandfather. And when you start to trace that back, the grandfather also has parents and grandparents. So again, this grows very quickly in terms of these surnames. So you have the 4 surnames for your immediate grandparents. Then you have 8 surnames for the great-grandparents, and so on. And so what you need to start thinking about is, what do your family surnames tell you about your quote-unquote African, quote-unquote Indian, and quote-unquote tribal identities? And so your surname should start to tell you something about your heritage. It should start to tell you something about who your ancestors were and where you fit in terms of the tree of life. Now we're going to revisit this listing from this book that we've looked at before, related to free African Americans of North Carolina and Virginia. And back then, of course, individuals were referred to as Negro or colored or black or Indian in some instances. And so what you have is, this is from the 1790 and 1800 census. And so this goes back further than many people are able to trace their lineage currently. However, that should start to change. All right, so you see the listing over to the right, and you see these names. It's a variety of surnames from a variety of places. One of the things that you might note is that these are free people back in the 1700s, 1800s, and for the most part, you don't see names that trace to Indian surnames. For the most part, you don't see any names that trace to what you would consider to be African surnames. And so the question that people need to start to ask is, from where did these people get these surnames? In the 1700s, in the 1800s, these are free individuals. They have these surnames. What do these surnames tell you about the heritage of the individuals? Now, some people are going to offer that they have these surnames because these were the surnames of the prior slave owners. I will offer, however, that you don't have proof that all of these individuals acquired these surnames from slave owners, particularly when you have names like Freeman. So that would not be a name that someone would be, generally speaking, be acquiring from a slave owner. And so one of the things that you need to start doing in terms of inductive and deductive reasoning is start to reason about why people would have these surnames if they were free individuals. And if you see your surname on this list, how did you get that surname? And so again, we can go over some of these surnames like Allen and Bowman and Boyd and Butler and Copeland and Cooper and Lewis and Price, Turner, Tyler, Walden. Where did these surnames come from? You have Stewart and Norwood and Evans and Case. We're going to quickly look at a few surnames so that you can kind of get the idea of how this works and how it should be working with your surname. So you can see very quickly we have the Webb surname. This is a surname that came from England following the Norman conquest of 1066. And you can see down below when the Webb family started to settle in America. You see they started settling very early. And so 1628, you see 1633, you see Richard Webb, you see Elizabeth, Christopher. And so if Webb is someone's surname, in terms of being in America, people should be able to start tracing those surnames back to specific settlers. And here we have the surname Antoine, and clearly Antoine came out of Provence, and you can see how Antoine traveled. And you can see in the 1700s, and Antoine arrived on Long Island in 1687. And then you can see in the 1700s, several Antoines arrived in Louisiana. So you see Charles and Claude and Francois. And you can see here with the surname James, that might be your surname, or you might know someone with that surname. This came primarily out of England, and you can see that it goes back to 1066 again. And you can also see that this is a Hebrew rooted word. This is a derivative of that. And so here you can also see that this surname James started to arrive again very early in America. You have the 1630s, you have Edmund, Thomas, Henry, and Ursula James. And here you can see with the name Freeman, the surname Freeman has both English and Irish roots, again dating back to 1066, and you can see when it first appeared. And you can also see when the Freeman started to show up in America. And so you can see they showed up in New Netherlands, 1620, Virginia, 1622, Virginia again, Massachusetts. So you can see that they showed up, these Freemen showed up very early in terms of settling in America. And here we have the surname Manuel, and this has both Italian and Spanish roots. And so you can see the surname Manuel was first found in Castile. And so that name traveled over into the Americas. You can see in the 16th century, so coming very early. Dominican Republic, 1535, going to Florida, 1563, Peru, 1576, 1592. You can also see mainland information, so arriving in New York, you can see arriving in Puerto Rico, and so you can also see how this name is traced, and you can also see that this also has some Hebrew roots to it. And let's look at this surname Macklin. This is a pretty common surname, and you can spell this a number of ways. This comes out of Ireland and Scotland and comes from specifically the west coast of Scotland and the Hebrides Islands. And we're going to take a little look at the Hebrides Islands when we get to the end. But it's important for you to note that that is the root of this, and you can see that this started to appear very early, and you can look at the tracing of that. You can also see down below when this name started to come into the West. And so in Montreal you have 1659, and then you also have in the 19th century you have settlers in the United States. Now you may find that different variations of this name actually appeared at different times, and so these are very specific people. It's also important to remember when you're tracing this particular name that it is related to the Lord of Isles, and it's also a Gaelic surname. And here you have the Jackson surname. This is a very common surname coming out of both England and Scotland. It's related to a personal name, and also it's a variation of John. And so you can see the very early recording of this particular surname. You can see back in the 1200s, you can see in the 1300s, and then you can see Jacksons started arriving in the mainland America area in the 1600s there. You can see going to Virginia, you can see Massachusetts, Maryland. And here you have the common name McDaniel, and this again is Scottish and Irish, and again coming out of the Hebrides. Again, you can see that this is a Gaelic surname coming from the personal name of Donald. You can see that the McDaniels started settling in America very early. You have Virginia 1711, Virginia again, New England, and you can see that they are settling from 1711 to 1739. So they arrived pretty early also. Now, as noted, many people are going to make note of the fact that their surnames actually trace back to Ireland, Scotland, and in some instances to different parts of England. And so one of the things that you need to start doing is not just stopping at looking at what's going on in the United States in terms of your surname. You need to start looking to see when your surname actually arrived in America, and then tracing back to see how you connect to the individuals who first arrived in the Americas with those surnames. And one common place that surnames come from for many people is Hebrides. And so again, it's important to start looking at some of these places because they are attached to your ancestors. And sometimes when you look at some of these places, you might find that you have an affinity for some of these places that you may not have known about previously. So we're going to look at Hebrides so that you can see what it looks like. And for those of you who have surnames that are originating from there, you might get a sense of why this may feel familiar to you. Now, this is Hebrides. One of the things that people are going to have to really think about is, again, are people looking for the truth of those roots? Are they invested in a particular outcome? Because if people are tied to a particular outcome, they are never going to find the truth, because the truth is going to pass them by. The truth can be staring them right in their face, but because they are tied to another outcome, they cannot see the truth when it is staring right at them. And so if you are tied to an outcome that says your ancestors came from a particular place, you are not going to actually find your ancestors, because in many instances, your ancestors are not going to be coming from the places you've been told your ancestors came from. And so it's important to keep an open mind and be willing to go down a variety of trails to figure out what the truth is. You can listen to people who are on the internet telling you to focus on people that you don't even know that existed 10,000 years ago, or you can start to earnestly look for your ancestral roots, for your ancestral tree. And again, if you are in the United States, there are many people in the Caribbean right now who are wondering why it is taking you so long to understand your heritage. There are people in Africa right now wondering why it is taking you so long to understand your heritage. Again, many people are talking about reparations, but prior to reparations, you need to fully understand who you are. In other words, just as people ask in Louisiana and many parts of the South, who are your people? If you don't know who your people are, you are not in a position to even think about what would be appropriate in terms of reparations. Remember, knowledge is power, and so is wisdom.